Welcome to DAO Deep Dives, where we interview DAO founders, core DAO contributors, and everyone else who works on the periphery of decentralized autonomous organizations.
Okay, so another very exciting episode today with Auryn Macmillan from Gnosis, and he's also involved in a ton of very exciting other projects, related projects, has been in the DAO space for many years. Super excited to have you here. Welcome, Auryn.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
You look like you're in an amazing place. I don't know. That looks really cool. A lot cooler than where I am, in my opinion. So yeah, tell us, who are you and what's going on?
Yeah. So I'm in Melbourne, Australia at the moment. I was just panning the camera around a little bit ago, showing the view of the bay here. It's a beautiful part of the world, but a little bit cold right now, just coming into winter. But yeah, hey, I'm Auryn Macmillan. I don't know, who am I? That's another really broad question. But yeah, for the context of web3, I guess we can limit it to that. Yeah, I work at Gnosis, contribute to a whole bunch of different projects that we're working on there. And then outside of Gnosis, poke my head into a variety of different places as well and try to make myself useful or contribute in some way. But yeah, broadly have been obsessed with the idea of DAOs since I kind of first stumbled across the idea as, I don't know, originally in some early kind of blog posts about, or forum posts about the idea of Ethereum in kind of 2013, 2014. And then ever since kind of 2016 and the DAO, I've been almost exclusively focused on DAOs kind of full-time in some capacity since then, in a variety of different roles, from kind of community management and community building to product management to facility development and everything else in between.
So Auryn, one of the questions we like to ask all our guests, and feel free to answer this from whatever perspective you'd like, is just simply, what is a DAO?
It's obviously a broad question, and yeah, plenty of room for interpretation. I guess I'd like to approach DAO mostly as a kind of philosophy, as an approach to kind of organization and community building, where the kind of intent is to give ownership and control of an organization to the community and the folks contributing to and building it. I'm a big fan of the way that Spencer Graham positions the definitions of DAOs, or I think he's maybe a bit strict in it sometimes. But one of the big qualities that he talks about frequently is capture resistance. Kind of organizations that, by the nature of their kind of structure, create this really nice kind of capture resistant property, make it really hard for an individual or a kind of cartel of individuals, cartel of organizations to take over that organization or to bend it to their will at the expense of the broader community. So I think that's a really kind of key quality of a DAO. I guess the other way that I'd lean into describing DAOs is obviously just from more the kind of implementation side, in terms of its, in an ideal case, a DAO really means this organization where you have code at the center and human inputs at the edges. They may or may not need to be coordinated inputs. I think systems like blockchains, one expression of a kind of DAO-like organization, where you have this kind of code at the center and then human interactions at the edges, where it's essentially people running node software or kind of interacting with the network. That is their kind of participation with the organization. And then you have, I think, what most people more typically think about as DAOs, these kind of things that are more analogous to a Web3 native version of a traditional organization, has some business goal that it wants to achieve, and then you have this kind of piece of code at the center that facilitates the coordination between all of the various stakeholders in that organization to allow them to execute on whatever their kind of business outcomes are. Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I started out by saying it's a really broad question because I think it's analogous to saying, what is a firm, what is an organization, which is a really broad question just in general.
Yes, that is very true. The specificity to what the organization is actually trying to do, influencing what that specific DAO, I guess, is very true. For example, you mentioned the code in the middle, right? I'm personally also a big proponent of that statement. However, in maybe something like a social DAO, that might not be so crucial, right?
And I think this is where you get into the arguments about kind of semantics, like whether you would consider something that doesn't have that code at the center, whether you would actually consider it a DAO. And I think there's this kind of, if you want to get really pedantic about semantics, then maybe you call these things aspiring DAOs or something like that, or DAOs in spirit or something. But yeah, I tend to lean more on the kind of permissive side there, where I said if this organization is operating with the intent and the practices that I don't know, mirror what DAOs do, even if in the kind of implementation it's not perfect. I'm totally fine with with organizations calling themselves DAOs. And I don't know, I guess the hope there is that they'll progress over time into something that is more truly a DAO.
So one of the organizations you're involved with, for people who may not know, is Gnosis, big player in this space, right? You guys are doing a ton of great stuff, I think. For most listeners, they might probably be familiar with Gnosis Safe, now just Safe, I believe, for one of the, if not the most popular multisig. I think I have not been in any projects over the last probably 2 years where there wasn't a Safe involved somewhere. So that says something. And yeah, let's go there for a minute. What's Gnosis? What's Gnosis Chain? What's Gnosis DAO? This is DAO Deep Dives after all. And why is it important for the world?
Yeah, another really kind of big, broad question, just because of the kind of nature of the Gnosis DAO and the Gnosis ecosystem. I guess maybe you can do a really quick kind of backstory on the whole thing, just to catch viewers up on kind of what Gnosis is and where it's at currently. So Gnosis originally started with the mission of bringing prediction markets to the world, building the kind of technology for, and then ultimately implementing prediction markets on top of Ethereum. Along the way towards that mission, because of how early Gnosis was to just the web3 ecosystem in general, it essentially needed to build a bunch of core infrastructure, critical infrastructure to allow itself to function. So the one that you hinted at, and that most people in the Ethereum space at least have interacted with, is the Gnosis Safe. Now, like you said, just Safe. This is a multi-sig wallet contract, or really just a programmable account. The core use case is multi-sig, but it's actually much more powerful and flexible than that, and we can dive into all that later. But yeah, this is one of the pieces of infrastructure. Some other pieces of infrastructure are things like CowSwap, this meta DEX aggregator. I don't know if that's how it's still being communicated, but essentially this thing that does batch order routing on all of the different decentralized exchanges to get you really great prices on any of your trades. So anyway, the point being here that kind of Gnosis, on the way to trying to build prediction markets, built a bunch of different infrastructure, and ultimately the infrastructure that Gnosis had built got much more traction than the attempts at prediction markets. And so the organizations pivoted to focus mostly on that infrastructure now. A few years ago, Gnosis made the choice to essentially transition its treasury out of the kind of traditional legal organization and into the Gnosis DAO, kind of wanting to be true to its kind of Web3 roots. And yeah, so we now have the Gnosis DAO set up, which is this kind of custodian of the broader Gnosis ecosystem. Teams like Safe and CowSwap have spun out to be kind of distinct organizations under that broader Gnosis ecosystem umbrella, still as kind of members or parts of the kind of Gnosis DAO, but definitely distinct. And yeah, you hinted at Gnosis Chain. This was a really interesting kind of interaction between two relatively large Web3 organizations and DAOs. Essentially, the network XDAI had been up and running for several years, and ended up being a proposal to both DAOs to do a kind of merger where Gnosis ended up providing an avenue for all XDAI stakeholders to swap their tokens out for Gnosis tokens, and for XDAI chain to become Gnosis Chain. And so Gnosis Chain has now become a big focus for the Gnosis DAO. It is kind of a parallel instantiation of the Ethereum beacon chain, where stakers stake GNO tokens now, and then still maintains the same quality on the execution layer, where you've got the gas fees paid in a stable coin in DAI. So yeah, I guess that's a good kind of backstory on, or a relatively quick backstory on kind of Gnosis, and where a handful of the major components of the ecosystem kind of came from and are at currently.
Nice. So, I mean, there's been quite a few notable DAOs and related projects on Gnosis chain. So, Colony, DAO House, DWork, which, by the way, I think has the best name, and then DXDAO, just to name a few. Do you have any favorites, or are there one that you're particularly excited about right now that I did mention or did not?
If we're talking about just on Gnosis chain, I have a real fond kind of soft spot for Colony. I worked at Colony for a number of years and have been a huge fan of kind of the organizational design of Colony, both as a kind of DAO framework, but then also Colony, the team, and kind of the folks that work at Colony and the way that it's structured as a team is just a real kind of joy to be a part of and a joy to kind of watch. Yeah, Colony is always a huge favorite. I'm also a huge fan of OneHive. I think they've done some really great work and have been live on Gnosis chain since well before it became Gnosis chain, since back in the XDAI days. And yeah, always keen to see what they're up to.
Amazing. You're speaking my language, of course. Listeners to this show notice Colony has come up once or twice, if for nothing else but me mentioning them.
Yeah, I think it's like the Colony white paper is something that I've, like, in talking to DAO enthusiasts, seems to be one of the real seminal pieces of writing that's pulled people into the DAO space, even if they haven't ended up using Colony or kind of interacting with Colony all that much. That's the thing that really triggered the light bulb going off for them and pulled them into this whole ecosystem. It's maybe, I don't know, 3 out of 5 people or 2 out of 5 people that I talk to about DAOs, like that is one of the real key pieces of writing that got them involved in the ecosystem.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I want to get back to this here actually in a minute, but we started talking about Gnosis and Gnosis DAO more specifically. I do want to stay there for just a minute and get your experience from an organization who has transitioned, first of all, from a centralized organization to then being governed by a DAO, and how that has been. And basically, I guess the question is, how does Gnosis DAO govern itself?
Yeah, so Gnosis DAO, let's talk about the kind of transition first off. So essentially, yeah, we had and still do have this kind of collection of legal entities and Gnosis GmbH and LTD and whatnot. But the kind of important part here was the migration of the treasury from Gnosis GmbH over to the Gnosis DAO. And essentially what we, in terms of the infrastructure set up for this, we, I guess in late 2020, started working on the implementation for this and did kind of a wholesale review of the DAO tooling landscape, and eventually just arrived at the idea that we weren't fully satisfied with any of them for a variety of reasons. We had a handful of boxes that we just absolutely wanted to check. One was we wanted to not make participation in governance prohibitively expensive for users, force them to delegate rather than voting directly. And so we were really looking for some way that we could do governance off-chain or in a cheaper execution environment. We didn't want to make decisions on a framework that made it, they kind of unreasonably restricted the DAO's kind of future ability to change that decision, or kind of gave us really high switching costs if the DAO wanted to move to some other framework or kind of change the way that it operated. And then we really wanted we wanted the funds to go into something that was very well battle tested. And so after doing this kind of review of all of the DAO landscape, we just realized that putting the fund into a safe was, in our opinion, the kind of safest way to handle this. And we ended up building this module to the safe at the time that we called the DAO module. The current iteration we call the reality module. And it's essentially a module contract to the safe. I guess for folks that aren't familiar with that, you have this. The safe has multiple entry points. One is the multi-sig entry point, where you require n of m signatures to trigger the safe to do anything. And then also has this module entry point where you can enable other addresses to just get unilateral control over the safe. And so this reality module uses an oracle, reality.eth, to bring the results of off-chain votes on Snapshot, on-chain, and then trigger execution from that. And so this kind of constitutes the kind of most important pieces of the DAO's setup, is this link between kind of off-chain votes and on-chain execution. And there's obviously some really nice qualities that we get out of that. One is the zero kind of cost to participation. So we can have really high engagement from the kind of broader base of DAO members. And then the other thing is being able to account for tokens held in a much broader kind of variety of places. So not only the kind of raw tokens held in a user's account, but also the tokens that they hold as part of liquidity pools, or where they're staking, or they've locked, or they've got it on mainnet or on Gnosis chain. There's probably 10 or 12 different places that the strategy currently accounts for when it's counting members' vote weight, which is just not achievable in the same way on chain, or at least wasn't at the time. I think there's some crafty ways that we could probably make that happen now, because we've got access to some more capable tooling.
One thing I found quite evolved in Gnosis is the proposal governance process you have in place. So tell us a little bit about that. How has that been? You have, I think, a 3-phase approach to any proposal that needs to be put through.
So we have this kind of 3-phased approach. Phase one is essentially just put up a post and start talking about it, kind of tell people what you're thinking, and workshop it with the community. Once you've gotten it to where the idea feels pretty well formed, then you put it into phase 2, which is essentially, here's more concretely the idea. Let's do an informal poll on the forum, yay or nay. And then after a kind of week in that state, then it's kind of free for anyone to throw it up on Snapshot and make it a formal proposal out of it. The kind of key part there is, I think the really key distinction between phase 1 and phase 2 is the inclusion of kind of whatever the transaction payload is. So phase 1 is kind of about discussing the whole thing and kind of figuring out what the transaction payload is that kind of corresponds to the idea that you want to implement, or the kind of sequence of transactions that correspond to that idea. And then phase 2 is about actually explicitly saying, this is the things that we want the DAO to execute. Do you agree with it? And do we have enough support here to then move it over onto the snapshot to where it could, if it reaches a quorum, actually get executed?
We're going down a very interesting path, I think. And you mentioned earlier already you worked for Colony for a while and clearly have spent much time in the kind of DAO framework space, DAO governance space. So maybe with all of your knowledge, how does one start a DAO today?
We talked about the kind of parallels between DAOs and on-chain organizations as compared to traditional firms, traditional organizations. And I think like those early stages, there's probably not a huge distinction. You start a DAO by having an idea of something you want to do and finding a handful of folks that idea resonates with and joining together in some way and getting started on it. The really super early stages are probably just a group chat or a Google Doc or somewhere that you can collaborate and start working towards it. I think where things diverge is that the next few stages after that, where you start to think about what types of resources your organization needs to have access to, in terms of whether it needs to be able to have a bank account and buy traditional insurance policies and this kind of stuff, or whether it's going to be interacting mostly with on-chain systems. I guess even in that case, those things aren't mutually exclusive, or DAOs don't necessarily not have access to those things. But there's some kind of layers of complexity involved there. And I think the other kind of key piece to that decision is just like what the thing that you're doing is, and whether or not it benefits from having this kind of really broad base of kind of ownership and control, like whether it benefits from this property of essentially capture resistance. And if it does, then yes, a DAO is probably the right choice for it. I think the other part there is, does it benefit from network effects, and specifically intra-network effects? Does it benefit from having broad base of participants that in such a way that each participant added to that community increases the value of the community by more than the sum of their kind of individual addition to the community? And again, if it has that quality, then probably a DAO is a good choice for how you structure that organization.
How do we double down on like the autonomous nature of DAOs? And so, how would a DAO then run and govern itself, perhaps?
Yeah. So the autonomous part there, I think, is interesting. I think a lot of people conflate autonomousness with like automation. They conflate autonomy and automation. They expect that a DAO is a thing that you put a bunch of the pieces in place and you somehow hit a button and it just does its own thing and works and no one has to have inputs. But what we're really talking about here is autonomy of both the organization, but then also autonomy of the agents interacting with it. So like a DAO, if, I don't know, in the really strict sense, the members of the DAO should be able to trigger it to do things without explicit permission from anyone else. Like they should be permissionlessly able to initiate processes within the DAO. And then obviously the DAO has some internal mechanisms to define whether or not that thing can happen. Vote, it requires typically some kind of quorum to be met in order for some action to be triggered. But I think this is like very hand-wavy, top-heavy version of a DAO that I'm talking about here. Like if you've got this idea of a DAO where members vote on proposals to trigger the DAO to execute things, then I think you asked about the kind of status quo earlier, and I think this is kind of the status quo, right? Is where you have an organization that spins up a community of people that have some stake in the organization, and everyone votes on everything to make stuff happen. And it's super inefficient, it's really slow, and I think limits the scope of what the organization can do or what it can achieve. And I think to really, live up to this kind of autonomous side or this autonomous kind of quality of DAOs, I think you actually need to implement mechanisms and organizational design that delegates decision-making power to other more efficient mechanisms that are domain specific, or to smaller autonomous groups of folks that the DAO can choose to kind of execute on its behalf, again, within some smaller, more constrained parameters. So talking about the former there, things like resource allocation, I think you can do in a kind of mechanistic way much more efficiently than everyone votes on everything. So things like quadratic funding are a good example of this, where you can say, we want to allocate some pool of funding to public goods within our ecosystem. So rather than everyone voting on kind of whether or not we make a grant to project A and whether or not we make a grant to project B and project C and so on, you say we've got this limited pool of funding, and anyone that's a public good in this ecosystem can apply to receive funding from it. And then how the funding is divvied up is decided on the rules of quadratic funding. So essentially based on the individual contributions that people within the community make to the kind of projects they value, that determines how the funds are allocated. So this is a mechanistic way of arriving at an outcome, the kind of desired outcome, based on the kind of uncoordinated and autonomous inputs of a whole bunch of individuals.
Yeah, did you see AI coming in there? Or how do we get to where less voting has to take place, or to make that process a little bit more streamlined so that way the DAO ultimately is more productive?
Yeah, AI, I'd really see it as a tool that people might use to mediate their interactions with DAOs, but I don't know that it necessarily, I don't see AI being something that takes a central role in DAOs, at least not anytime soon, essentially because it's incredibly trustful, right? It's trustful in terms of someone owns the hardware that this DAO runs on, someone has access to its internal secrets. So like it can't really, you couldn't really have a DAO that just kind of hands off all operations to an AI, because that's akin to just handing off all operations to whoever controls the AI, whoever controls the system it runs on. So it's antithetical to what a DAO is. But I could see a scenario where a bunch of the individual members of a DAO decide, hey, I can't keep up with all of the proposals, so I'm going to have this AI do kind of some kind of sentiment analysis on all of the proposals that are coming through and cast my vote according to what it knows about me and my preferences. I could see something like that being a viable and likely scenario, but probably not the former. It'd be really fun to just spin up DAOs specifically for this. We say, hey, the intent is for this to be each member to have its own AI that's kind of working on its behalf.
That's incredible. So segue into the next question then is, let's say someone is doing their homework to develop a DAO and they're listening to this podcast in order to do so. How do we decide on like tooling and frameworks? Like, how do you guys at Gnosis decide on that sort of thing?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the kind of spinning up of the Gnosis DAO. Like the three criteria that we really wanted to check off were not unreasonably restricting the kind of future decision-making power of the DAO, or kind of not introducing really high switching costs if it wanted to kind of migrate to some other setup or change its setup in some way, not imposing unreasonably high costs to participation, really high gas costs for voting, and then making sure that kind of wherever the kind of DAO's assets are ultimately secured is somewhere that's really kind of battle tested. And so these three checkboxes ultimately led us down the path of choosing safe as the core to our DAO, and then plugging in other mechanisms as modules to that safe to ultimately turn what is typically, or what is originally a multi-sig, into something that is much more DAO-like. And so that whole process led us to the insight of, for DAO frameworks, ideally you want to decouple accounting from control. You want to have a persistent thing that is your DAO's account, its avatar on chain, and then you want to be able to plug in any number of different mechanisms that might control it into that account. And I think this is where the kind of first generation of DAO tooling all made a really critical mistake there, where they kind of tightly coupled accounting and control into either one contract or into kind of a tightly bundled system of contracts that then introduces really high switching costs when you want to migrate from one to another. And so when new folks are entering the space now, the big thing that's the big kind of architectural decision that I try to encourage them to explore. Is like, how do you set this up in such a way that you can make a decision now and it's not going to introduce massive switching costs for you later when you realize that the organization needs to change and evolve and grow in some way? Because in reality, that's what organizations do. You rarely make a decision in the first few weeks of the organization that, especially about the kind of architecture of the organization, that is persistent for the next decade. Like, organizations need to be able to grow and adapt. They need to be dynamic. And so making decisions up front that allow organizations to do that and do that safely, I think, is really important. And this kind of sequence of insights is what led us down the path of creating Zodiac as a standard, which is really just a way of expressing this idea of decoupling account and control using a safe, or at least something that exposes the same module interface, and then plugging modules in as the things that control it.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the advantages of a composable DAO tooling system like Zodiac, and why people should pay attention or spend more time maybe learning about those concepts rather than over-engineering what they think will be the forever structure for their DAO.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. The forever structure for a DAO is almost baking failure in from day one. Like, it's near impossible to get structure right immediately, and probably just implies an untenable amount of upfront work that distracts from the organization's core focus. So yeah, what we encourage organizations to do is, just start out as a multi-sig and then plug in mechanisms to change that multi-sig into something that more adequately reflects the organizational structure that you want that the organization wants to morph into. And so one really nice quality of this is that you avoid a significant chunk of the kind of switching costs between tooling and between frameworks. In particular, what I mean there is that, so say traditionally you got into the DAO space and you said, okay, we're gonna spin up an Aragon DAO. All of our assets go into Aragon. We've got this Aragon mini-me token that constitutes our kind of vote weight in this organization. Our Aragon DAO controls a handful of external systems, and that address is what kind of other websites and whatnot point to as our kind of on-chain entity. And now 2 years later, we realize, hey, Aragon is no longer the right fit, or there's this hot new DAO tool that we want to try out, and we want to migrate from Aragon to hot new DAO tool. You now have this massive switching cost where you've got to move all of the assets, or first you've got to spin up the new DAO, and then move all of the assets from the old DAO into the new DAO, update all of the systems that this old DAO has a role in. If it's the owner of any DeFi protocols or anything like this, then you've got to make updates to all of those systems. And then you've also got to get anywhere external that references this old address to now change its reference to the new address. And so this is a massive coordination burden. But if you had decoupled the kind of accounting from the control, then you have this ability to have a persistent kind of on-chain avatar in this safe controlled by your Aragon DAO. And then at some point when you decide you want to try this hot new DAO tool, then you spin up your new DAO, you have your old DAO, enable the new DAO as a module, new DAO, disable your old DAO as a module, and migration complete. No assets have to move, no kind of roles have to be updated in external contracts, and no kind of external references to your DAO's avatar have to change. So you cut out all of that switching cost just by decoupling those two things.
So Zodiac provides a solution to control a safe beyond, say, just 3 of 5 or 5 of 8 or whatever kind of treasury department, but actually control it through other external modules or DAO tooling frameworks or really anything they want. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And we should be careful there as well to say Zodiac doesn't provide this functionality to the safe. This is functionality that existed natively on the safe already. The safe had this module interface. The reason that we decided to create this kind of distinct brand around it, or this distinct kind of persona around it, was one, kind of not to king make the safe more than was necessary. It was this kind of pragmatic decision to say the safe is just by far the most popular, well-trusted contract account that kind of has this functionality. So it makes sense to just build the standard on the existing implementation rather than building yet another standard and expecting people to migrate to it. But Zodiac is really just a formalization of the interface that already existed on the safe for adding modules. And yeah, the idea here is that you've got one entry point, which is the multi-sig entry point, and then you have this other entry point, which is the module entry point on the safe. And when you want to move from multi-sig to kind of module-based control, then you just enable modules on the safe, and then eventually, kind of when things feel right, disable the multi-sig signers, remove all of the multi-sig signers, and just have the modules control the safe. Each can control the safe unilaterally. Modules don't need approval from the signers don't need approval from the modules. You can have multiple modules enabled in parallel, so you can have your Aragon DAO and your hot new DAO tool enabled in parallel, so you can fall back to Aragon if the new tool stops behaving how you expected or doesn't work out. So you can do these kind of really wild and wonderful combinations of tools to have DAOs that are really composable and have the ability to fully express the organizational structure that you want to create.
The year was 2016. I was at a brewery on a patio, drinking a beer with a few friends that were all participating in something and had some funds in something called the DAO. I understand you were involved with that to some degree. And at the time, it was like frustrating, but it's still one of my favorite memories, right, of the whole time I've been in the space. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the year was 2016. I was playing basketball professionally at the time, which is just another part of my backstory we didn't talk about earlier. My previous life was as a professional athlete. And I had just gotten home for practice, taken like an afternoon nap, woke up and the world was on fire because the DAO was being hacked. was wild. I guess I got involved in the DAO really early and helped to spin up the forums that ultimately became the kind of de facto home for the DAO. This was DAO Hub. And then through that, obviously participated in and got to know a large part of the DAO and thus Ethereum ecosystem. And this is one of my kind of fondest memories of kind of interactions with the Ethereum ecosystem, even though it was a catastrophic couple of months. It was, I guess, a baptism of fire into, community building and community management and just kind of Web3 in general.
Cool. So very interesting to be a pro athlete and also deep in this space. I think that's extraordinarily rare. Another thing, well, a DAO that comes to mind immediately is Kraus House. Is that something that you follow or are a member of?
Yeah, I've followed. I guess I am a member. I do have some Kraus tokens, and know the founder or one of the founders of that quite well. It's a really neat project, and I'm really hopeful that they actually get to achieve their end goal at some point and to get a kind of significant stake in an NBA team. That'd be super cool to see. But even in the meantime, like I love what they're up to, supporting a whole bunch of more grassroots basketball efforts, which is super cool to see.
So, as our listeners by now, I'm sure, understand, you're involved in many very interesting projects. Yet another one I want to throw at you, which is ClearFund. And yeah, just tell us a little bit about that. I don't even want to give an intro to it.
Yeah, so ClearFund, started up a number of years ago as well. Now, it was originally a hackathon project and kind of started up in response to a bunch of discussion that was going on at the time about block reward funding. Essentially, would it be possible to fund Ethereum infrastructure development by having some portion of the block reward be reserved for a dev fund or something like this, for kind of funding Ethereum's public goods? There's a whole bunch of pitfalls with this kind of idea of block reward funding being redistributed in this way, and so it ultimately has never actually been implemented. There's some people that will very vocally and viciously oppose any attempt at bringing this subject up. But out of that discussion, I think there was a handful of folks that became really obsessed with the idea of just how do we fund public goods for the Ethereum ecosystem. This is what ultimately led to Gitcoin taking the form that it has with Gitcoin grants. And yeah, ClearFund was mine and a handful of other folks' attempt at kind of solving this same kind of problem. Like, how do we allocate funding towards Ethereum public goods? And so it's a implementation of quadratic funding that is kind of built on chain using zero knowledge proofs. The MACI, which is the minimal anti-collusion infrastructure, is this really powerful kind of suite of tooling for doing secret on-chain voting, and it enables us to build this really quite powerful quadratic funding protocol that has this collusion resistant property without needing off-chain kind of post hoc analysis of kind of the distribution of voters and funds and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, we've been running ClearFund rounds for a couple of years now. They've all been relatively small scale up until last year, where we ran a few rounds that were in the kind of hundreds of thousands of dollars in matching pools, one for the Ethereum staking community and one for the Latin American community around the time of DevCon last year. And again, around for Ethereum public goods in general, running on Arbitrum.
Amazing. So many projects, many cool things you were involved in. What did you want to talk about we didn't touch on? We always like to give our guests a chance to take the stage and not just have us direct a conversation. Is there anything top of mind you're super passionate about these days you want to chat on for a little bit?
Yeah, I think we've talked about a handful of the different projects that I've been involved in and kind of work in, but I don't know, what I've observed is this overarching theme in many of the different things that I've been ultimately contributing to. Maybe it's partially the direction that I end up wanting to take things that I contribute in, is just this pattern of kind of modularity and composability. And yeah, just like at a high level, I think this is a really important design choice, a really valuable design choice to make for kind of anything that folks are building, or for most things that folks are building in the web3 ecosystem, is essentially building things in such a way that others can come and build on top of it, can extend it, can take what you've built and plug it into another system and turn it into something totally different from how you expected it to be used. I think this is one of the main beauties of this kind of shared execution environment. We have this global shared computer that we can all interact with. So building tools that play nicely with other tools is such a fantastic, again, kind of expression of and kind of use for that shared execution environment. I don't know, I guess like where possible, build things that conform to standards so other people can easily go and extend them. Like the whole reason that DeFi exists the way that it does is because people use standards, because people build represent positions in one thing with an ERC20 token that folks then can go and use to plug into another system. Zodiac is the same kind of philosophy where you have a standard kind of module interface and you can make arbitrary chains of modules because they all conform to the same interface. Anything that can interact with that interface can be part of that chain. Any of the traditional DAO tooling or the kind of first generation of DAO tooling can plug into that permissionlessly because they can all make arbitrary transaction calls, but you also can do this thing where you can make much smaller, more focused pieces. I've likened this often to like Linux pipeline programming, where you have these really small modular components that you can chain together in these arbitrarily complex ways to make much more interesting systems. And then I think the latest expression of this is we've been working on a solution to the kind of bridging problem, essentially recognizing that the vast majority of kind of bridge related incidents could have been mitigated if there was some kind of redundancy baked into the bridge, or at least the systems dependent on bridges. So essentially, like most of the bridge related kind of security incidents, which all of the highest value or the majority of the highest value to security incidents in the Web3 space in general could have been avoided if rather than one bridge mechanism having the unilateral permission to mint tokens on a given network, the ability to mint that canonical representation of the token required some consensus between multiple different mechanisms. In that case, then you have to break multiple mechanisms in parallel and convince them both of the kind of same incorrect state, which is much more difficult than exploiting one at a time. And yeah, we've been working on this project called Hashi, which is this kind of hash oracle aggregator that allows us to do just this, build this thing that's analogous to a RAID array of built kind of computer system, this redundant array of independent disks. In our case, a redundant array of independent hash oracles where you can set up a set of and then a minimum threshold of those oracles that need to agree on any given state change in order for other things to happen. And really nice quality of this is it has the standard Oracle interface that anyone can build an adapter for to plug into any Oracle they like, choose to use whatever set and threshold of Oracles they want to interact with and to control their system. So modularity, I think, is the overarching thing there. Modularity for the win, composability for the win.
Yes, I love it. So go 10 or 100x out in either scale or time in the world of DAOs. Where are we at? Or both scale and time, maybe.
I think time probably, if DAOs work as intended, then hopefully time allows the other to allows scale to 100x as well. I think the idea with DAOs, I think the one reason that a lot of folks are interested in them is because of the kind of scale that they should in theory be able to reach. And I think blockchains themselves are a really good example of this, where you can have this thing that participation in can scale more or less indefinitely in a way that just continues to increase the kind of security of the network, but does not necessarily introduce inefficiencies in a way that a traditional firm cannot. As you scale a traditional firm, you almost always introduce more and more kind of inefficiencies. And so I think this is one of the things that people are most excited about, or one of the kind of realizations that lots of folks have about DAOs as an organizational structure, is they have this ability to potentially scale much larger than traditional firms. I'd caveat that by saying this is probably only true of DAOs that have quite tightly scoped ways to participate. So the way that you participate in a kind of cryptocurrency ecosystem, at least in terms of what you'd consider the DAO portion of it, is quite constrained. For kind of more general purpose DAOs, I think it probably still has some of this quality, but scale is going to introduce inefficiencies, perhaps at just a different rate to more traditional organizations, or at least like you have some different strategies for dealing with those inefficiencies that you may not have access to in traditional organizations. I don't know, going 100x out on time for DAOs, I think, is probably beyond me a little bit, because I have no idea how technology is going to evolve in the next century, especially given the amount that it's evolved in the previous century and the kind of rapid rate at which kind of technological evolution is increasing. So I think I have no idea where it's going to go 100 years from now, but in terms of scale, like I would really love to see, and I think we will see at some points in the next, I don't know, few decades, some much larger scale DAOs on the scale of, I don't know, nation states in terms of the access to capital and the kind of sheer volume of members. I think to enable that, there are some really critical pieces that are still missing. In particular, I think private receipt-free voting is really key. There's not good implementations of this yet. And I think this is one of the limiting factors for DAOs being used in context like a nation state, where it's really vital for the democratic process to work as intended, that votes are receipt free, that you have a secret ballot. So yeah, I think, that's, I don't know, if you're out there and looking for a problem to solve for DAOs, that's one of the really big ones.
Nice. I think if Crosshouse somehow pops up in conversation on like almost every episode somehow. So I'm going to use him as an example, but woke up and just thought, oh, I want to buy a basketball team. Like, that's pretty crazy. Have you had any of these crazy ideas that should be a DAO that haven't yet, or you think someone might do? What's crazy in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. I have these kind of DAO ideas, I don't know, daily. But the one that I persistently come back to that is one of these ideas that just feels way too big to actually try to do, but at some point maybe I'll be crazy enough to give it a try, this is outing myself as just a total nutter, but at some point I would love to see a DAO that takes on the mission of just building a space elevator and like acquiring some large piece of land somewhere and attempting to build a space elevator. And I think the actual mission of the space elevator itself may be, I don't know, maybe unachievable. Like it may not actually be technically possible, but I think there's so much interesting and valuable R&D that you would do along the way to trying to build that the organization would ultimately be worthwhile anyway. Whether or not it does end up building a space elevator, who cares? It's this outrageously audacious goal that could potentially be big enough to draw a critical mass of people in to want to participate in. And yeah, I'd love to kick it off at some point. I've thought about this a whole bunch of times, like how do you position this in a way that makes it fun to participate in? Like maybe it's the Space Elevator Jazz Club or the Space Elevator, something like it. Kind of making a play on like elevator music jazz or something like that. Maybe you spin it up as a noun DAO where each noun corresponds to one trip of the space elevator or something like this.
Somebody out there right now wants to get a hold of you specifically for what you just said. So, what's a good way for our listeners in the audience to get a hold of you and reach out?
I don't know. Twitter's always easy at Auryn_Macmillan. Otherwise, Telegram or Discord or email or conferences or anywhere. I'm pretty easy to find and get a hold of, and always down to chat with folks about anything and everything DAO related. If someone wants to make or help make the space elevator thing happen, then absolutely reach out. Again, it's a ridiculously audacious thing to try to do, but I would love to be a part of trying to make it happen.
Fantastic. This has been super fun. I know this is still the morning for you on the other side of the world, pretty much. So we very much appreciate you hanging out with us for a little while. Thank you so much for coming on, Auryn. It's been a blast.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
And that's a wrap. Spin and Solve are your hosts for DAO Deep Dives, a podcast about all things DAO. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.